There's a crate of avocados at a farm gate on the road out of town. Next to it, a rusty jar with a handwritten sign. No one is watching. You slow down. You grab a bag. You drop your coins in the jar and drive off. And you never once think about the strange thing you just did. You paid a stranger who wasn't there. Why wouldn't you? That's just how it works out here. But stop and look at what actually happened. Nobody made you pay. There was no camera, no lock, no bloke standing guard. You could have taken the whole crate for nothing, and no one on earth would have known. And yet you didn't. Almost nobody does. Something invisible held you in place. That invisible thing has a name. And in 1629, on a low strip of coral off the coast of Western Australia, it vanished completely. What happened in the weeks that followed is one of the darkest stories this country owns, and most people have never heard a word of it. The real reason it went the way it did is far stranger than the idea that some people are just born evil. Here's the part that should bother you. The men who did the killing weren't monsters. They were bakers, soldiers, cadets, ordinary blokes who, a month earlier, would have been sick to their stomachs at the thought. To understand how that's even possible, you need to sail out to the islands with them. The ship was called the Batavia. She was brand new, the pride of the Dutch East India Company, the richest and most ruthless corporation the world had yet produced. In 1628, she set out on her very first voyage, loaded with silver, trade goods, and around 340 people, bound for the spice port that shared her name in what's now Jakarta. She never arrived. In the small hours of the 4th of June, 1629, she struck Morning Reef in the Houtman Abrolhos, a scatter of tiny islands off the Midwest coast. The hull tore open in the dark. Around 40 people drowned that night. The rest, men, women, children, sailors and soldiers, scrambled onto a handful of coral islets barely above the waterline, with almost no fresh water and very little food. Picture that for a second. You've survived the wreck, and now you're standing on bare coral in the middle of the Indian Ocean, watching the water run out. The commander, a company merchant named Francisco Palsart, made a hard call. He took the ship's longboat, a skeleton crew, and the skipper, and set out to find help. Not down the road, across open sea, more than 2,000 kilometers of it, all the way to Java. It was an extraordinary piece of seamanship and an act of quiet desperation, but it left a hole. For weeks on those islands, there was no captain, no company, no law, and no one coming. Just frightened people and a shrinking supply of water. And into that hole stepped a man named Geronimus Cornelius. Cornelius was the under-merchant, the second in command left behind. On paper, he was respectable, educated, well-spoken, charming. In truth, he was a bankrupt apothecary from Harlem, running from his debts and his past, and before the ship even sank, he had been quietly plotting to seize her. Now fate had handed him something better than a mutiny. It had handed him a few hundred stranded people and no one to answer to. What would you do if every rule that had ever held you suddenly didn't exist, and no one was left to enforce a single one of them? Cornelius worked it out with terrible clarity. There wasn't enough water for everyone. A rescue ship, if it ever came, would need to be captured and stolen, and for that he wanted a small, loyal, ruthless crew, not a crowd of witnesses. So he began, coldly and methodically, to reduce the numbers. It didn't happen in a frenzy. That's the detail that stays with you. Over the following weeks, Cornelius and a circle of loyal men murdered more than 100 survivors. Sailors, families, women and children. Some were drowned, some were killed in their sleep. It was organized, almost bureaucratic, dressed up in the language of necessity and survival. The people carrying it out weren't foaming at the mouth. Many of them had been perfectly unremarkable men only a few weeks before. But the story doesn't end in the dark. Because Cornelius made one mistake. Early on, he had sent a group of soldiers to a larger island nearby, supposedly to search for water. In reality, it was meant to be a death sentence. He assumed there was nothing out there, and that they would simply die of thirst, conveniently out of his way. The soldiers were led by a low-ranking man named Veeb Hayes, and against every expectation, Hayes and his party found the one thing no one believed existed on those islands: fresh water. And food, in the form of small wallabies they could catch. Word spread. Terrified survivors began slipping away from Cornelius's island, swimming and rafting across to Hayes. Almost by accident, a soldier no one had thought twice about became the leader of the resistance. His men built a rough fort out of limestone and coral blocks, a structure that still stands today and is often called the oldest surviving European building anywhere in Australia. Armed with little more than sharpened poles and homemade pikes, they beat back attack after attack from Cornelius's better-armed killers. They held. When the rescue finally came, Pelsart, returning on a ship called the Sardam that September after his brutal open-boat voyage had somehow succeeded, it was Hayes who reached him first, rowing out to warn him before the mutineers could seize the vessel. The killers were rounded up. Trials were held there on the islands. Cornelius and several of his ringleaders were hanged, some with their hands cut off first. 2 of the youngest offenders were spared the rope, and instead marooned on the Western Australian mainland, left to whatever fate was waiting for them. No one ever heard from them again. They may well have been the first Europeans to live out their lives on this continent. Now, you could file all of this under gruesome old legend and move on. Plenty of people did, for centuries. But here's why you can't. In 1963, the wreck of the Batavia was found again, right where the records said it would be. The Australian writer Henrietta Drake-Brockman had spent years piecing the story together from the Dutch archives and translating the commander's own journal, and her detective work helped pinpoint the site. Since then, archaeologists from the Western Australian Museum and the University of Western Australia have dug on the little island the survivors grimly nicknamed Batavia's Graveyard. And they found the victims. Skeletons in shallow, sandy graves, some bearing the marks of sword cuts and crushing blows to the skull. The bones say exactly what the journals said. It happened. The historian Mike Dash, who wrote the definitive modern account, laid out in painstaking detail how an ordinary, charming man talked ordinary men into monstrous things. Which brings you back to the question you have probably been avoiding. How? It's comforting to believe the killers were simply born wrong. A different kind of human. But that isn't what the evidence, historical or scientific, actually shows. And this is where a shipwreck from 400 years ago starts to feel uncomfortably personal. In the early 1960s, a psychologist at Yale named Stanley Milgram ran an experiment that has disturbed people ever since. Ordinary volunteers were told by a calm man in a lab coat to deliver what they believed were increasingly painful electric shocks to a stranger in the next room. The stranger cried out, begged them to stop, and most of the volunteers kept going anyway, all the way to what they thought could be a lethal jolt. Not because they were sadists, but because an authority figure told them to, and because the responsibility felt like it belonged to someone else. These weren't villains. They were your neighbours, and a clear majority of them obeyed. Decades later, the psychologist Albert Bandura gave the pattern a name: moral disengagement. His work showed that people rarely switch their conscience off. Instead, they quietly reframe. They dress cruelty up as necessity. It's them or us. They soften it with tidy, bloodless language. They stop seeing the victim as a full person with a name. Do that in small steps, one justification at a time, and an ordinary mind can be walked into things it would have refused outright at the start. Read the Batavia story again with Bandura in mind, and Cornelius's cold talk of necessity stop sounding like madness and start sounding like a technique. And it isn't only the laboratory. The historian Christopher Browning studied a unit of middle-aged, unremarkable men who became mass killers during the Second World War. Not fanatics, not psychopaths, but ordinary men swept along by peer pressure, obedience, and the slow, grinding normalization of horror. The same shape again. Give people the wrong situation, strip away the rules and the watching eyes, and the line between Weber Hayes and Hieronymus Cornelius turns out to be far thinner than any of us would like. So ask yourself honestly, which one would you have been? Almost everyone pictures themselves in the fort, standing with Hayes, sharpened stick in hand, on the right side of it. And maybe you would have been. But the quiet lesson of Milgram, of Bandura, of Browning, and of that lonely strip of coral is that the situation does far more of the work than we would ever admit. Most people, dropped into the right nightmare, drift towards the crowd. Not because they are evil, but because the thing that normally holds them in place is gone. That thing is the whole point. The invisible pressure that made you pay for the avocados. The unspoken agreement that other people are watching, that the rules mean something, that you are seen. It feels flimsy, almost like nothing at all. But it isn't nothing. It's the entire scaffolding that keeps ordinary people from becoming something else. On the Batavia's islands, it dissolved in a matter of weeks. And the people left standing in the ruins weren't a different species. They were us, with the scaffolding pulled away. So the next time you drop your coins in a jar at an unmanned farm gate and drive off without a second thought, notice it. That small, unremarkable act of honesty isn't human nature quietly winning. It's human nature being held in place by something far more fragile than you assume. The Batavia is what waits on the other side of it. And the most unsettling thing about that story was never how monstrous those people were. It's how ordinary. You're one of the people who's watching now, so make it count. If this got under your skin, hit like. It puts the story in front of the next person. And subscribe for more of the stuff the textbooks left out. The line between the fort and the crew was thinner than we'd like. Keep looking at it. See you in the next one.